You are listening to the Prepared Warrior Podcast, where law enforcement and military trainers discuss cutting-edge training, tactics, and technology. Here is your host, John Wilson.
You are listening to Season 1, Episode 11 of The Prepared Warrior. I'm John Wilson. Our guest for this episode is Dr. Terry Wollert. I like to start every episode with a quote. This one is from Lord Calvin, who said, "If you cannot measure it, you cannot improve it." All right, our guest for this program is Dr. Terry Wollert. He holds an undergraduate degree in adult technical education and graduate degrees in psychology, curriculum design, and evaluation. He has spent over 20 years conducting training research for 90-plus federal law enforcement agencies at the largest law enforcement training organization in the world. Dr. Wollert is a certified force science use of force analyst. Since his retirement, he conducts firearms, use of force, and scenario-based training at the Institute of Public Safety, a post-certified law enforcement academy in Gainesville, Florida. Dr. Wollert has several publications on the effects of acute stress on police officer decision-making and motor skills, including his latest book, A Scientific Approach to Reality-Based Training, that he co-authored with Jeff Quail, the CEO of Setcan. Thanks so much for joining us today, Dr. Wollert.
Thank you for inviting me to participate in this podcast.
So first, how did you first get involved in doing research on the effects of stress relating to police work and police training?
Well, whenever I was working at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, we had identified some issues in terms of how do we need to go through and evaluate student performance and try to find ways to make sure that we were maximizing our training and maximizing the evaluation process. So as we got into it, it started out as research to identify a survival score, for a lack of a better term, so that, as we were to go through and we'd evaluate a student's performance, that by identifying certain characteristics, and we would evaluate students' performance against those characteristics, that hopefully we would identify those that would have a better chance of surviving any type of lethal or serious law enforcement encounter.
Okay.
With that research, it gave me an opportunity to work with a couple of leading experts in the world, one being Dr. Charles Spielberger, who was the creator of the state trait anxiety anger inventories, and Dr. James Meyerhoff, who was a endocrinologist and psychologist at Walter Reed Army Hospital, where he was looking at a lot of things with respect to post-traumatic stress disorder and how we could identify, or how he could identify those elements, for soldiers that were engaged in our combat situations. So as we worked with it, we kind of thought, we had been looking at Bruce Siddle's work on, that he identified in his book, Sharpening the Warrior's Edge. And, he identified several characteristics such as, heart rate and things of that nature, and kind of identified a scale of performance as to at what point in time did individuals' performance start to deteriorate as part of that process. So that was kind of our original intent, was trying to confirm some of Bruce Siddle's work. And as part of that, we hope to identify optimal levels of psychological and physiological stress, so that, is there an area or a zone where if we got our students working in that, they would have a better chance of succeeding that encounter. Unfortunately, the research, when we started it, we couldn't confirm his findings that he had in terms of what effects, his heart rates and things of that nature had, on performance, when we limited the stressors to a psychological type of encounter. In other words, we limited any physical contact and what have you, so that what we were measuring specifically was the psychological impact during the scenario or the activity. And then we monitored, a variety of things like heart rate, cortisol levels, psychological indices, and things of that nature. Try to go through and identify some of those survival score indexes. Unfortunately, it didn't work out that well.
So what did you find about the way stress affects people, or did it require more research on your part?
It did. It really pointed out that there was additional research that was needed, as well as it identified that how we were going through and conducting the evaluations needed to be improved upon. Because in order for us to be effective, in a training environment, and we're dealing with scenario-based training, is that we needed the ability to be able to go through and evaluate student performance in real time. And the way that we had structured the original experiment, it required countless hours of viewing videotapes of students' performance and assessing them against a large number of performance objective indexes as to how well that these individuals performed. Now, the physiological and psychological indexes were fairly easy to obtain in most cases. The psychological, we did through a self-assessment type of thing. In the physiologicals, we had heart rate monitors and blood pressure monitors on the individuals. And then we took cortisol samples at various stages during the experiment, and then those items were analyzed and compared against, what the performance elements were.
Can you explain what cortisol samples are?
Well, cortisol is one of the indicators that whenever you have somebody that is exposed to stress, and then you get what we refer to sometimes as the chemical cocktail that is released throughout the body, and which is going to be the adrenaline and a wide variety of other chemicals that go through the body that changes and affects the physiological responses of individuals. And the cortisol was one that we could take. In this case, we use saliva samples to be able to go through and collect how much cortisol was in the system. And based upon the amount of cortisol, that would give us indicators as to how much of the chemical cocktail had been released by the body.
So what would you say, after doing a lot of these different techniques to evaluate, what would you say is the most effective scenario performance evaluation technique?
Well, if we were get to the performance evaluation techniques and we're going through and trying to pull some of these things together, we found that the physiological indicators really didn't give us, anything that we could use in a predictability perspective. Granted that, as individuals' levels of stress went up during a given scenario, we did get elevations of heart rate, blood pressure, both systolic, diastolic. We got increases in cortisol levels, which, again, part of that chemical cocktail. Unfortunately, none of those indicators could be linked statistically as a predictor of the performance of the student during a scenario. We did find, though, that whenever we went through and we looked at the psychological indicators, and more specifically what we found was that elements of anxiety and anger, probably had more of an effect, and that we did find that they were more predictive in terms of what an individual's performance was going to be.
Okay, so what would you say is important to understand about the effects of anxiety and anger during novel, sudden, or close proximity encounters?
Well, one of the things that we found is that they really limit one's ability to make effective decisions, but not only did they affect individual decisions, but those emotional levels affected an individual's response time. In many cases, what we saw was that as levels of anxiety and anger increased, an individual's ability to respond to an encounter also increased, which, whenever you get into a real-time type of encounter, the longer it takes you to respond means that you're getting further and further behind the curve. The other thing that we really identified in there, that anger, or in some cases I'd like to refer to it as frustration, had a greater effect on performance than in anxiety, which we also associate with fear. So in many cases, what it really kind of broke down to is that anger levels increased significantly as the individual's perception of their ability to control the situation diminished. So the less control that they perceived that they had, the higher their anger levels, and which resulted in a greater effect on performance. And that, as we went through that, we also identified that those increases in emotional levels, and anxiety or anger, can occur whether or not the threat was real, or if it was just perceived. Right. So it really kind of focused on that. The difference in all of this is the individual and their perception of that particular situation.
Right. So if the individual feels like they're in control of the situation, then thus they would have less, anxiety or frustration. Then they will react, I guess, with a clearer head and quicker.
Absolutely. Now, and the thing that was really kind of interesting out of it is that, we would always see elevations of anxiety and anger, but the amount that these things we refer to as changes from baseline is that for those that had better control or self-image of that control, had lower elevations with respect to their baseline numbers than those that did not have their perception or the ability to control the situation.
What would be an advantage of I guess, giving a student this kind of feedback, after scenario training by kind of supplying them with this information?
Well, I don't know that in given an individual, telling them, okay, well, this is where you were on the anxiety scale or the anger scale, really contributes a tremendous amount because it's kind of an abstract term to them. But what one needs to focus on whenever you're going through and giving them that feedback is what effect is it having on their performance, and as they're going through, and getting them to kind of do some introspective review of their abilities as to, well, how much did you perceive that you could control that situation, and based upon that very arbitrary type of analysis, then look at the individuals and go through and say, okay, now you see what happened during this scenario and what your response times were to the situations. And in many cases, those delayed response times were as a result of impaired decisions. And, that was really kind of the crux of what it was that we found that we would go through. Now, we could and did during some of our research sessions, I would review with the individuals some of the physiological responses in terms of their increased respiratory rate, increased heart rate, and increased blood pressure, things of that nature, and show them how those levels were increased whenever they were making poor decisions or their response time was delayed.
Because there are many different aspects a trainee could be evaluated on. What would you say are the core performance elements? Would you say a lot of those are to do with response time or decision making, or is there other performance elements?
Well, whenever we started out looking at some of the the performance elements and things that what do we need to go through and deal with as we're evaluating somebody, we had well over 100 individual items whenever we first started out going through and trying to evaluate student performance. And as I indicated earlier, this was not practical whenever we were trying to go through and try to conduct a real-time assessment, as we were going through and doing our training in a scenario. Mm-hmm. So we went through, and again, I put together an excellent team of subject matter experts, and we kind of did what was sometimes referred to as a modified Delphi technique, and we looked at over those 100 items, and we started looking at them and saying, okay, is there a way that we can group these things to reduce the total number of areas that we needed to focus on? And that we went through and we developed out a process, and we had broken it down to like 8 items. And even though, we had reduced that 100 plus items down to 8 items, it was still somewhat overwhelming for an instructor to evaluate on a real-time basis. So we've looked at it again, and we found that, okay, well, we can group some of those other items together, and ended up with what we refer to now as the 4 core performance elements that are outlined in the book. And looking at those things, one of the elements that we had on there would be decision making. Those would be things of whether or not you're going to have to shoot or don't shoot, what weapon do they need to select to deal with the thing, whether or not they needed to be just talking to the individual, whether they needed to listen, or whether things had digressed to the point where now they were going to have to force the situation. And that decision making component is very crucial as they're going through and dealing with controlling a suspect or whatever the situation may be in their law enforcement encounter. But that decision making had to be based upon situational awareness. Their ability to identify threats or pre-assault indicators, or pattern recognition, and being able to take at some of those components of the assault crews or the behavior of the individual and predict in, okay, if they do this, then this is what they're likely getting ready to go through and do, so that now I have myself prepared mentally to be able to go through and do some of these particular responses. And then the responses fall out into an area that we refer to as physical skills, whether that be firearms, empty hand control, handcuffing, tactics, any number of those components, all group into that area that we would classify as a physical skill. And then to kind of top it all off, none of those items are really going to be all that important if they're unable to effectively communicate. And whenever we go through and we talk about communication, one of the very important components of that is command presence. And I did some analysis in terms of the performance and things of that nature, and always recognized that command presence was a significant predictor of an individual's ability to succeed in a scenario. But what I found was that single element of command presence had a 99% predictability factor. So that if an individual was able to demonstrate effective command presence, then they had a 99% chance that they were going to win that particular encounter. If they had weak command presence, then there was a 99% chance that they would fail that particular encounter. So it had a very real-time component associated with an individual's success or failure during a law enforcement encounter. Now, another part of that, and that deals with the law enforcement arena, is the written reports. Many cases are won or lost based upon the effectiveness of the individual's officer ability to write down what happened and what they did and the level of details that can be used to effectively prosecute the individual suspect. So, there's a lot of things, and again, we get into other elements such as their radio communications and their ability to deal with nonverbal communication type things as well. So those really became, the critical elements that we need to focus on whenever we are evaluating an individual during a reality-based training scenario.
So the book you co-authored with Jeff Quail, it's called A Scientific Approach to Reality-Based Training. What was it like putting this book together with Jeff?
Well, Jeff is probably what I refer to as the consummate professional. He is such a pleasure to work with, and he is so insightful, and plus he has a breadth of experiences from his law enforcement background in Canada that he was able to provide I guess some down to earth cop speak type of interpretations of some of the things that I was coming up with from a scientific perspective. So it was, to me, it was kind of like a marriage made in heaven, in that Jeff would help me translate some of the stuff that was very scientific in nature into terms that would be more easily understood by the average cop on the street.
And so in the book, you talk about reality-based training scenarios, and what are some of the keys to designing reality-based training scenarios? Because a lot of the scenario success, I guess, is based on this pre-planning.
Absolutely. And one of the things that, I think any of us recognize that as we're going through and conducting reality-based training is that it is a very time-consuming and expensive process. You've got role players involved, you've got instructors, you've got different sets and things that that where you're going to be conducting the reality-based training, all of the equipment that goes along with it. So it is a labor and resource intensive activity. Mm-hmm. So if we're going to be doing reality-based training, then we need to try to maximize, the results of that training, and try to control what we're doing from an expense perspective, so that we are training what we really need to train, and not just out there training for the sake of entertaining the instructors. And one of the things that Jeff and I came up with as we were going through and dealing with this is what we refer to as the ADAPT model, which is basically means that where we assess, diagnose, prescribe, and train individuals. So the reality-based training scenarios need to be able to support those four aspects of what we're trying to go through and deal with. So when we get ready to build a reality-based training scenario, we start off with, we need to identify the objective. What is it that we're going to try to go through and train? And as a large part of that, in some cases, we're, like say in the States, we deal with what they refer to as post requirements. So we need to make sure that the objectives that we have identified can be directly linked over to one of those post requirements, which identifies what skills and or things that a police officer must have in order to be certified as a police officer. So we want to make sure that we have that lineage, and we do that through the identification of the objective. Once we do that, then we kind of draft out, okay, what do we want to do in this scenario, and provide some kind of description that is basically defining the scope of what it is that we're going to go through and do in this particular scenario. Now, as part of that, it means that we have to identify the critical skills that are going to be associated with this scenario. And one of the things that I have observed with a lot of training scenarios that people are using in that is that they have a tendency to identify too many of these critical skills. And that was basically the same problem that we had, when we first started the research process. We had over 100 items identified in that scenario, even though it was a multi-part full scope scenario. It was just way too many items. So it really forces you to say, okay, what skills am I going to focus on right now? Keeping in mind, we're trying to satisfy, that original objective and the ability to assess, diagnose, prescribe, and train along with it. Now, once we've identified the critical skills, then, we need to determine, okay, what is our method of assessment? What are we going to need to determine whether or not the skill was successfully performed? And then once we have those items, we can start going through and looking at, within the scenario, what equipment, role players, what instructions, student briefings, diagrams, or anything else that we may need in order to successfully set up the situation for this particular scenario. Now, once we have those items, we go back in and we start looking at those critical skills in that, and we develop the assessment instrument. Now, within that, one of the things that we found throughout the research is that there was problems with the traditional GoNoGo type of evaluation that is generally used for scenario-based training. And I'll give you an example. One of the things that we found is that a very simple mandatory process is if you have a weapon malfunction, we go through a procedure that we refer to as a immediate action drill to clear that weapon malfunction. Well, if we're dealing in a traditional GoNoGo type of evaluation instrument, there are a prescribed set of steps that one must go through in order to perform that immediate action drill. And if you fail to do any one of those steps, then by definition, it is a no-go. So what we found is that there are situations to where an individual may not do everything exactly perfect, but they still accomplish the overall intent of the scenario, which led us to the rating scales that we have, where we took it from a desirable to a not acceptable type of an assessment. Now, when we look at that particular component, desirable is obviously, what we want. That's perfect. Everything was done exactly the way that it was supposed to have been done. And then we get into acceptable, and now, almost perfect, but not quite perfect. But it is still acceptable because they were able to accomplish the goals of the scenario. Then we get into an area that we refer to as marginal, and now, we're starting to see some areas that, students are identifying some significant performance issues and things that we know that we're going to have to go through and correct. And then we have, the area that is not acceptable. And not acceptable, we limited to areas where, the individual during the scenario violated the law, or their actions would have resulted in a serious injury to themselves or to someone else, or they failed to do something that would have resulted into a serious injury to themselves or to someone else. And by drawing that line of saying that, okay, that was what is not acceptable, then that constituted an automatic failure for that scenario. And if you had a not acceptable in any one of those critical skill areas, then, they failed that entire scenario and they would have to retake it. That was a tough transition to get across to a lot of the evaluators, because in many cases, the evaluators that I worked with, while very skilled and professional individuals, if the student didn't do it the way that they would have done it, then they said it was not acceptable. Where in reality, it was just different. It may not have been perfect, but they didn't violate any laws, and they actually accomplished the intent of the scenario. So it really kind of forced a very clear dichotomy between success and unsuccess. And then we also had then the ranges of success. So now if we wanted to go through and if we had a cut score of 70% or 80%, whatever it was, you could correlate that or calculate that based upon the number of desirable, acceptable, or marginal items that the individual had during a scenario. So, if they got less than whatever that cut score was in terms of total points, then they would have failed the scenario and have to repeat it. Whereas, again, if they had a not acceptable in any of them, then that was an automatic failure for the scenario. And again, we were really looking out for, the agency and for the student from the standpoint that, if they violated the law during the scenario, then there's no way that we should be able to say that person successfully completed that scenario. Now, that led into, some other areas that we had. So we got through and we talk about desirable, acceptable, marginal performance levels. And that means then you need to develop an assessment rubric, which is basically establishing the standards. This is what they need to do in order to receive a desirable, or this is what they can do, or what areas that they can maybe not perform perfect and still receive an acceptable. And if they do these things, then we're going to score, the performance as marginal on there. And what that is doing with that assessment rubric is that we are applying an element of standardization so that every instructor that is doing the evaluation of the scenario has what the standards are, and then when they're scoring a student, then we get more consistency, in that scoring process. Now, the other part of designing, effective reality-based training scenarios is we need to select and train the role players. And we do outline several components in the book of what these particular role players need to be able to go through and do. And one of the toughest things that we encountered, during the research and even during training is, whenever you're using instructors as role players, they don't like to lose.
Right.
So they will do things that may be counter to what we want the student to experience, because that instructor doesn't want to lose that situation. It's just in their nature. So we have to train the role players to, if the student does this, then you're going to do this, so that we get some consistency in what, that role player is going through and doing. The last element that is very critical to successful reality-based training scenarios is that we have to train the evaluators. And one of the things that I've done to going through and training them is I will take scenarios that have been videoed, and I will bring in the group of evaluators, and they go through, they look at the performance, and then they will score it based upon what their observations and interpretations were of that particular thing. And then after they've scored it, I go through with the instructors and say, okay, how did you score this? And then look at areas where there's differences. If one instructor rated it higher than the rest of the instructors, or vice versa, then we would go through and look at that and say, okay, now why did you do that? And in some cases, as part of that training process of those evaluators, we had to go back in and make some adjustments to our scoring rubric because one instructor may have observed something that nobody else saw, and it was a very valid point. And so that one instructor could then go through and influence, and so we get kind of a continuous improvement process to the scenario and the evaluation components that go along with it. So it is a little bit time consuming, but it is critical if we're going to have any degree of consistency between the evaluators that's going through and evaluating student performance, and as well as achieving a degree of standardization in this process. And, there is a component that we refer to statistically that is referred to as inter-rater reliability. And that is that, we need to make sure that, that we have a consistent evaluation, and that, one instructor is not maybe scoring somebody easier, or maybe there was something that they didn't like about them, end up scoring that person harsher. So we get a fair type of evaluation for student performance.
With that kind of scale of evaluation as opposed to the pass-fail evaluation, do you often think in the evaluation process students can, say, justify something in conversations after with the instructor? So maybe they were judged a certain way and they said, well, this is the reason I did it this way, and that might affect their score, or instructors need to be strict with how they're evaluating? No.
That's why, I always, whenever I'm training the evaluators, is that evaluation form is in pencil.
Right.
and you don't complete the evaluation until after you've gone through the feedback process. And that was one of the benefits whenever we looked at the student-centered feedback model that we describe and discuss in the book, is that that is really given the student an opportunity to go through and explain what they did and why they did it. Now, that can be a double-edged sword for the student. In many cases, the student's going through, and based upon what their perceptions were and what they perceive their skill levels at, is that they chose a given option and how they were going to go through and try to solve that problem. In other cases, I've had students that went through and had stellar performance. And I'll give you a real live example of that. Had a student that went through, one of the scenarios during the research project where this happened to be a petite female that was having to go through and clear a room, and the room had a very large male individual in there that refused to leave. Well, the student went through, demonstrated outstanding command presence, identified herself, told the individual that they needed to leave, explained what the alternatives were if they didn't leave, and and the role player in that case, I'm not leaving. Student immediately drew out their baton, approached the individual, and told them that if they didn't comply with their commands, that she was going to use the baton and place that individual under arrest. And as luck would have it, the role player grabbed the baton and jerked it out of her hand. And before he could even come around to do anything with that, she had drawn her service weapon and covered him down and was issuing him orders to get down on the ground and that he was under arrest. And if he didn't comply, she was going to shoot him. And we were all looking at it and said, outstanding, that was great. Well, but during the debriefing, she went through and she said, whenever I got into that room and I saw how big that guy was, I knew there's no way I was going to be able to handle him physically. So I figured if I gave him a weapon like my baton, then I could use my handgun to go through and control him. So, outstanding performance, but clearly did not understand, the rule of law that goes through in saying that, you can't create the situation that would allow you to shoot somebody.
Yeah.
And in our case in the States, we have, very clear constitutional guidelines for officers, as well as an alternative that says if you have a size or skill disparity, is that you don't have to use a lower level of force option in order to control the suspect. So in her case, she just didn't understand, the laws associated with, use of force. And had we not gone through that feedback session, we'd have never found that. Because most of the time, whenever they do real well, it's pat them on the back and say, okay, great job. Send down the next one.
What do you think about using video-based scenario simulators to conduct use of force training, as opposed to, live action reality-based training?
Well, as we mentioned earlier, anytime that we go in and start doing, live role player reality-based training, that is a very cost-effective, time-consuming process. Not to mention, whenever we're going through and trying to maintain a degree of consistency, because, from role player to role player, from student to student, as to what they're going to see. So I'm a great proponent of video-based scenario simulators to be able to do use of force instruction, because I know exactly what the role player is going to do whenever they're going to present the situation. And the scenario itself is designed in such a way that I know exactly what skills that I'm looking for out of the student, and that the role player will, for every student that faces it, see the exact same set of conditions to be able to go through and react to it. So they become an excellent cost-effective tool to teach decision-making, situation awareness, weapon skills, and more importantly, in many cases, communication. So, as we're going through and providing those opportunities to students to go through and do. It also is an extremely effective tool in being able to help students identify, where their strengths and weaknesses may be. Because I can go back through and, and again, whenever, the situations or the scenarios and simulators that I use, I also have video capture, so I can capture what the student said and did during the scenario. So I can play it back and I can show them exactly at this point in time and, maybe point out some things that they may have missed. Like say, for example, some of their situation awareness, where, had they been properly scanning the threat, that they may have noticed or should have noticed that there was a weapon, in the role player's back pocket or something of that nature. Because, the scenario is designed so that it will show those things so that, I can start helping develop those skills like situation awareness. So it really becomes effective in being able to go through and identify those strengths and weaknesses. But I also find that, the video-based scenario simulators is probably one of the most underutilized tool in the training arsenal. Because, in many cases, the instructors are not properly trained in how to go through and conduct these video-based scenario simulations. They will oftentimes limit, what they're doing to just a simple decision of was it a shoot or no shoot type of situation, and not capitalize on things like situation awareness and communication skills and their ability to go through and articulate what they did. Because one of the things that I have found as a very effective tool as I'm developing students and running them through these simulations is I have them go back through and describe for me, again, using the student-centered feedback model on there, information of what they did and why they did it, and do it to reinforce the key elements that they need to include in their written reports. So they are now getting practice verbally going through and describing the level of detail and the pieces of information that they need to have in order to go through and write that written report. Some of that may be, pretty straightforward type stuff, as being able to accurately describe the individual that was involved in the situation or the scenario, to describing, their behaviors in terms of what we refer to as facts versus conclusions. Like for example, I want them to go through and tell me, so, well, the student made this move with his hand after I told him not to make any sudden movements, as opposed to, well, I thought the guy was going for a gun. The fact that what you thought the guy was going through and doing, that's your conclusion on there, but it's not necessarily sufficient facts that whenever you have to go to a court inquiry or investigation, that justifies what you did and why you did it. So, and which means that it takes a little bit more time to run people through those types of scenarios. The other thing that I see as a weakness in many of the video-based simulators is the scenario selection. There are many excellent scenarios out there, but there are just as many, if not more, scenarios at a point where, there was things that the role players did, maybe how they were dressed and stuff of that nature, that is not consistent with, the total picture of what it was that you were trying to present in the scenario. As an example of that, we have, a lot of times they're using actors to come in to be the role players. And, as they go through, maybe they're coming in dressed in, decent street clothes and stuff of that nature. And yet they're supposed to be playing the part of a street bum, and out on a street corner or somewhere, in a bunch of boxes. And you see somebody that, may be, trespassing in a building, and they're dressed in fine clothes, and now they're trying to convince the student, and the scenario is set up to where, okay, you just got a bum that's trespassing, and you're going to have to, make some decisions based upon the fact that they're a bum, as opposed to the fact, there's something wrong with this picture. I got somebody that is dressed real well. Are they just there trespassing, or are they really, some other type of criminal? Maybe they were, doing a real breaking and entering, getting ready to do a burglary or a robbery or some other type of activity. So you can miscommunicate to the student what it is that, that role player is supposed to do, because there are some things that are out of context with the design of the scenario, if that makes sense to you.
Yeah. Do you think the might be a shortcoming of the video-based scenarios is, I guess, the amount of stress you can induce in a person with a video screen, as opposed to, I guess, a real physical person in their space?
There are limitations, in a video-based simulation, that is very real. I have yet figured out how to go through and make that transition to, okay, now they're having to go hands-on with, that role player that is in that video-based scenario. It's pretty tough to do on video, whereas in a real-time scenario, yeah, they can go through and do that. So that becomes a limitation of the design. But as far as the levels of stress that can be induced, what I found is that, I can induce comparable levels of stress in video that I can whenever I get into a real role player type of scenario. The technology is there to be able to go through and do that. And I've been working with some organizations to enhance their simulators, and to the point to where we can make those situations a little bit more realistic, where you got multiple views as opposed to just going through and doing a single wall presentation to enhance situation awareness. But there are limits to that in terms of how much more stimulus can you provide to somebody to where it now is becoming too technology intensive that it is now reducing the effectiveness of what it is that you're trying to accomplish. How many situations, if you're going through and doing building clearing or room clearing, where you got round rooms as opposed to you've got rectangles and squares and things of that nature that you have to go through and deal with, as well as doorways. So, and the technology is there to support that. But with that increased technology comes increased expenses as well.
Right.
And I think that's a question that, that I want to look at in the future, is, whenever I'm dealing with some of this advanced technology, at what point do I get what I refer to as diminishing return?
That's true. Yeah. How much difference does it make in certain cases? So when it comes to the effects of stress, what's a reason that some people are able to react and make smart decisions under stress better than other people, in the exact same scenario? Is there, because I guess people just, physiologically and physically are different than one another, right? And so there's just certain people who are just more adept to that, right?
Well, there are different differences in people. Mm-hmm. But the one thing that drives, the level of stress that an individual has is the individual perception. And that is one of the reasons that it is very difficult in many cases for instructors to go through and try to rate or classify, their scenarios and say, okay, yeah, this should be a very difficult or a very stressful scenario. Is that because from their perception and their skill level, either it would be or it wouldn't be. Whereas if you got a student or another person coming in, depending upon their perception as to, what the degree the threat is, it's going to have an effect, because the perception is what's going to drive the, the emotional levels, as well as induce the amount of that chemical cocktail that's going to be released into the body. Mm-hmm. So if they perceive it different, then, the reaction is going to be different. Now, this could be due to their confidence and their competence, whether that's perceived or real ability that they may have. So somebody that has more confidence and competence is probably going to perceive a given situation from a less stressful perspective than somebody who doesn't have that confidence or competence in their ability. So that becomes a major player into it, which is that, the emotional components on there and the effects that they have is a trainable element, which is, why, things like stress exposure training are so effective in being able to go through and prepare individuals for these, high stress types of situations. They've been doing it to treat phobias for years. Somebody that has a fear of flying and stuff of that nature, through stress exposure training, they can condition them to the point to where they have, they no longer have that fear of flying. We also can look at it, and the military's been doing it by going through and exposing people to, more scenarios and combat types of situations, is that when they get into a combat situation, it's going to affect them a little bit less. But again, the quality of the training that one receives in that stress exposure training is going to make the difference as to their confidence and their competence. And one of the greatest risks that we have with that is that whenever we have individuals whose confidence exceeds their competence.
Right.
they can get themselves into situations thinking, I can control this, and then rapidly they are in a situation to where things are spiraling out of control, which escalates, those emotional levels significantly to the point that, that's when you get into, the fight, freeze, flight types of responses that is, innate to all human beings.
So, if there's one, important key lesson to come through your book, I know there's so many different kind of chapters and subsets of lessons, but what's kind of the most important thing that people could take from a scientific approach to reality-based training?
One of the things that I found through the research that I guess it was enlightening for me was the standpoint that anger had a much greater effect on performance than did anxiety. In other words, the individual's perception of their ability to deal with the problem would override, the fear factor as to, whether it scared them or not. And there's certain things that, from an anxiety perspective, that you'll never eliminate. If you're going around in a dark building doing a room clearing and you hear the slide on an 870 shotgun rack, I don't care how experienced you are, everybody knows what that sound is, and the anxiety levels are going to go up immediately. But whether or not that's going to have a detrimental effect on your performance is going to be greatly influenced by the anger levels that is associated with it. One of the other things that, and I guess, because of some of the things that, I've seen, a lot of people go through and do, where they will do a physical exercise to elevate heart rates and stuff of that nature of individuals whenever they're going through or getting ready to go in and perform a scenario or even any type of fine or complex motor skill. And while physical stress is a very important component, and it does have a significant factor in limiting an individual's ability to perform, the psychological components don't affect individuals' ability in the same fashion. And as an example of that, what I observed during my research is that individuals, let me put it this, I built in a weapon malfunction during the scenarios, which required individuals to perform an immediate action drill to clear the weapon malfunction. Okay, individuals going through the scenarios had elevations of heart rate, blood pressure, cortisols, all of those components on it, as well as that they had elevations in their emotional levels, the psychological stress on it. But some individuals were able to go through and perform that immediate action drill and not have any issues with it as well. It was almost like an automatic response. Weapon did this, they immediately did the tap rack re-engage process. So some were affected, and others that may have been showing the same levels of psychological and physiological stress were unable to perform that immediate action drill. And one of the things that was really kind of interesting was that those individuals that didn't have difficulty performing it had very little recall that they even had a weapon malfunction, where those that had difficulty performing it all remembered exactly that, the weapon malfunction and that they couldn't get it cleared properly and increasing the level of stress that they had during that situation. And in talking to these people, the difference between them was those that were able to perform it successfully had practiced the skill to the point that they had developed what we refer to as a mental model, so that when they had the sensation that they had a weapon malfunction, it was an automatic response. They just did it. They didn't have to think about doing it. Where those that had not trained to that same level whenever they had the weapon malfunction, it took them a while to realize that, one, that they had a weapon malfunction, and then what did they need to do to go through and perform that particular skill. So what we're talking about with this whole scientific approach to reality-based training is developing those critical skills that we need as law enforcement officers so that you can perform when it hits the fan, and that you don't have to stop and think about it. You just have the ability and you just do it. But it's not just everything being automatic, because one has to be able to think under those conditions. And that was one of the greater issues that I had identified, was that the levels of anger and anxiety occurred at, their impairment of decisions occurred at much lower levels of those emotional states. So that becomes a very critical part of what you're trying to go through and do with reality-based training.
Appreciate you taking the time to talk with us today, Dr. Terry Wollert. It was a great learning from you, and I hope our listeners get a lot out of this. So thanks again, and have yourself a great day.
You too, and I wish you all the best out there.
This has been the Prepared Warrior Podcast. For more info on our guests or other episodes, check out thepreparedwarrior.com. If you have any questions, comments, or ideas for the Prepared Warrior Podcast, email jon@thepreparedwarrior.com.